On March 3, 1983, Robert and Richard Garriott formed Origin Systems Incorporated. The company's motto, which was thought up by Robert, was 3 simple words. It represented everything that Richard valued creatively and all of his hopes for the future of entertainment software. We create worlds. And boy would they. The company, which was created with $70,000 of startup capital, humbly began in the garage of Owen and Helen Garriott, the boys' parents. An upper floor would be divided into Robert's business office and the development studio, while the 3-car garage itself became a manufacturing and shipping warehouse. Any games produced by Origin would have their boxes hand-folded and manually shrink-wrapped. When Origin Systems was founded, there was an uncertainty in regard to direction. The most sensible thing to do would be to hunker down and make more Ultima games, and of course Richard would do that. But why stop at video games? Many concepts were thrown around: business software, computer peripherals, entire operating systems. This was a time in computer history when creative, out-of-the-box thinking was regularly breaking new ground and making fortunes. During this time, the personal computer market was undergoing dramatic changes, as made evident by Ultima II's many ports. The IBM personal computer, Commodore 64, and Atari 8-bit family of computers would each act as potential alternatives to the long-dominant Apple II. Thanks to its now robust software catalog and open system allowing for hardware upgrades, the Apple II would continue to hold its own. Nonetheless, the personal computer market was becoming complex and multifaceted. This was especially true when compared to the simplicity of increasingly popular home video game consoles. Thankfully, several of Richard's associates were willing and able to create ports for his games, namely Chuck Boucher, affectionately known as Chuckles. Chuckles, who had comparatively little programming experience, would single-handedly helm many of these ports. He and Garriott had already been friends for years, but his ability to work on multiple versions of their games made him even more indispensable to Origin. This freed Richard to continue iterating on his work with the Apple II, and that's exactly what he did. Starting their own company was all well and good, but the reality of business was unchanged. Where was Origin's revenue coming from? $70,000 was nothing to scoff at, especially back in '83, but Richard was forced to contend with operating costs for the first time. Without a product to show for it, the money would dry up faster than you can say, ho-yo-he-hum. While conceptualizing the next Ultima game, Origin made several attempts to break into the hardware market. Some, such as a dual joystick device, were practical but just didn't work out due to manufacturing issues. One particularly unorthodox unit, deserves a mention. This is the Nauseator. It's a plywood box suspended by 2x6s that was intended to serve as a spaceflight simulator. It was called the Nauseator because of the distinct sensation one feels when exiting the device after 5 minutes of use. To quote Garriott, "We learned from the Nauseator to focus on what we did best, computer games." Still, one can't help but imagine a world in which every living room is equipped with a Nauseator. With that, Origin refocused their efforts on making video games. Thanks to connections Richard had made in the industry, advertisements for the newly formed Origin ran in the Apple II-focused magazine, Soft Talk. They weren't advertising anything in particular, just announcing that they'd arrived on the scene, and to remember the name, Origin. You'll be hearing it again and again. A bold move from a group of boys in their mother's garage, but proof that they meant business. Having developed his skills in assembly language during the development of Ultima II, Richard was ready to apply his newly acquired expertise. Ultima III was going to be bigger and better than its predecessor. Ultima II's engine, whose bones were comprised of somewhat amateurish assembly, was scrapped, and a new engine would be written from the ground up. Originally, Garriott wanted the entire game to be displayed in an immersive pseudo-3D, a la the dungeons from previous Ultima games. Not only that, but rather than having one character to control, the game would have 4. Hence the working title of the next Ultima game was Ultima 3D 4P. Comparisons between Ultima 3 and the Wizardry series would have been inevitable, even more so than they already had been. For various reasons, the 3D perspective concept was scrapped, but other sweeping changes would still be implemented. Ultima III's biggest advancements over its predecessor would be technological rather than narrative in nature. With their noses to the grindstone, Origin Systems would go on to release Ultima III Exodus on August 23rd of 1983. The contents of Ultima III's game box were more elaborate than ever. Like Ultima II, the third game came with a cloth map and several player guides, 3 in fact. The Book of Play, the Ancient Liturgy of Truth, and the Book of Amber Runes. Each of these 3 manuals is printed in a unique color and contains critical information in the playing of Ultima III. For now, let's focus on the box itself. Exodus saw Richard Garriott reuniting with Denis Loubet, the man responsible for the original Ultima artwork. Garriott's mother, Helen, was actually going to provide the cover art, but in the end they went with the decidedly more professional Loubet work. I do think there is a certain eerie, lo-fi charm to Helen's cover that suits the game. In any case, the game's cover depicts the titular Exodus, the progeny of Mondain from Ultima I and Minax from Ultima II. Its design was inspired by the demonic figure Chernobog from Disney's Fantasia, and it also caused some controversy. From 1979 through the 1980s, an organization known as the Moral Majority had a strong voice in American politics and culture. The issue they were focused on was the perceived moral decline of modern society. Of course, this was also during the Satanic Panic, a period in which fear of secret satanic cults was widespread. This paranoia dominated headlines, giving the Moral Majority's crusade gasoline. It also made parents feel that their children were at constant risk of having their hobbies subverted, at worst by agents of the devil himself. Heavy metal, comic books, and horror movies all found themselves in the crosshairs. Perhaps most prevalent of these hobbies was Dungeons & Dragons. Concerned activists saw the tabletop game as promoting illicit activities and deifying evil. While video games would tend to fly under the radar, some things became impossible to ignore, such as Exodus adorning the cover of Ultima III, who bears a striking resemblance to the Prince of Darkness himself. The founder of the Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell Sr., condemned Garriott and his games as a corruptive influence on America's youth. For the first time, Lord British found himself in the crosshairs of a religious firestorm. From entertaining with simple stories inspired by Tolkien and Time Bandits, to receiving letters accusing him of being, quote, the satanic perverter of America's youth, Richard Garriott's life had taken an unexpected turn. Yet, as they say, any publicity is good publicity, and Ultima III was eagerly picked up by CRPG fans. The question is, how was the game? Before digging into Ultima III, let's briefly discuss the game's ports. This is the first time that the port situation becomes complicated to address. There's one particular high-profile port of Exodus that's so intrinsically linked with the series' later history that I plan on returning to it at a later date. So it's not that I don't know it exists, it's that it deserves special attention in the future. Let's then take a look at some of the more contemporary ports to see what was available back in the day. We'll start with the base version of Ultima III on Old Reliable, that is the Apple II. Visually, there aren't many differences here compared to Ultima II. The user interface itself might be the single biggest change. The in-game graphics, player information, and various other odds and ends are compartmentalized. It does give the game a neater, more professional appearance, if you will. But Ultima I, for example, is able to display 30% more tiles on any given screen, which makes Exodus's real estate feel cramped. This change was functionally necessary, however. The interface now shows more information for more characters. Details are abbreviated. For instance, you'll see here that Sylvie is a female elf ranger. She's got 2 magic points, she's level 1, she's got 100 health and 133 food left. There's a lot more relevant information, but this is about all they could cram onto the screen. The other noteworthy change here and across all versions is the addition of character animations. Now, these animations are literally as simple as animations can be while still technically being an animation, 2 frames. It definitely does add a splash of movement and personality to these otherwise static screens. The Barbarian, for example, always flexing. Welcome to the gun show, baby. It's not true for every single sprite, but it's true for the vast majority of them. Even the game's introductory screen includes a nice little animated sequence where a party takes on a dragon and gets torched. Compare that to Ultima II's intro screen and the improvement is clear. Aside from those minor changes, the game looks and feels as you might expect. Black backgrounds, white characters, tiles presented in various colors. Then there's the Atari 8-bit version. Just to clear things up, the Atari 8-bit was a home computer series. I'm not referring to the Atari 2600 home console. Its presentation is largely the same, but there's one major difference that sets it apart. The Atari version of Ultima III is the first game in the series to have a musical score out of the gate. A soundtrack to the Apple II version was added retroactively, but it required additional hardware that wasn't exactly affordable. The system could produce bleeps and bloops if forced at gunpoint, but music wasn't on the table until the advent of the Mockingboard. Released in 1983, the same year as Ultima Exodus, the Mockingboard was a dedicated sound card of sorts. Tech like this was necessary if you wanted to improve the very limited sound capabilities of most computers back then. As the 80s went on, computer manufacturers started including sound hardware in their default configurations. Hardware like the Atari 800's Pokey chip, which does a pretty good job of handling multiple channels of sound. The game's soundtrack was composed by Ken Arnold. Ken, being a synth geek, was excited to work with this tech in order to help improve the game. It was an arduous task due to the complexities of sequencing music back then, and in the Apple II's case, working with very limited space. In the end, it worked out. The game's soundtrack amounts to only a few minutes of music, but the compositions are quite nice, and the Mockingboard tech in particular is used well. One particularly inspired choice was having certain versions feature Rule Britannia as the personal theme song of Lord British. This isn't the last we'll be hearing of this tune. Beyond the music, it's tough to say anything about the Atari port because every time I try to boot up a new game, the system just makes this noise for several minutes. And then it crashes. But I have it on good authority that it's more or less identical to the Apple II original, aside from the advent of music, which isn't a small thing. Next up, there's the Commodore 64 version. Interestingly enough, I find this port to be sort of a downgrade when compared to Ultima II's C64 version. The graphics here maintain the solid black backdrop of the Apple II version, as opposed to the full color visuals of Ultima II. This version of the game also has a full soundtrack. Even though the Atari sound chip has a technical advantage, I personally find that the Commodore version just sounds better overall. Even though it's not as impressive as Ultima II's port, I think that the Commodore 64 version might be the best of Ultima III's lot. That is, of course, aside from the Marty, which isn't fair because, again, the Marty version came out 7 years later. It just mops the floor with most of these ports. While there are some later ports that are impressive, the end of the line for us is the IBM version. As with Ultima II, it stunk. With its 4-color CGA graphics, complete lack of musical capabilities, and bugs galore, it was an unimpressive specimen, and definitively the worst way to play back then. So this is the version that we're gonna be playing. You guessed it, once again we're relying on our old friend, Voyager Dragon, author of the Ultima Upgrade Patch series. As was the case with Revenge of the Enchantress, Exodus can be drastically improved with this program. It brings the game up to the later EGA 16-color standard, fixes bugs, and arranges the original compositions in MIDI format. The jury's out on whether this is the definitive way to play, but personally I find that it's spiritually close enough to the original release that it doesn't feel like cheating, if you know what I mean. With that, let's talk about Ultima III Exodus. The previous game ended with the death of Mondane's apprentice, Minax, and this resulted in 20 years of peace. Unfortunately, it seems the two of them gathered in what could only be described as unholy union, and the fruit of their unholy loins was an entity known as Exodus. With the birth of this demonic spawn, the time of peace rapidly came to an end. Earthquakes shook the land, volcanoes erupted, and comets of ill omen streamed across the sky. Monsters took to the land, brigands began plundering, and the great earth serpent of legend emerged from the ocean. From the depths of hell he comes for vengeance, so said the citizens. These ill omens signified the imminent reign of Exodus. That's where our story begins. You control a group of 4, count 'em 4 heroes. This makes character creation more complex by orders of magnitude. Instead of choosing between 4 races and 4 classes, you're now choosing between 5 races and 11 classes. Not only do your individual options increase, but now you've got to keep in mind party composition, stats that complement each other. Ultima 2's agility stat has been changed to dexterity, while charisma and stamina have been paired out of the game altogether. This leaves 4 attributes: strength, dexterity, wisdom, and intelligence. The emphasis is on creating a team that balances these 4 stats effectively. Were there only 4 classes, this would be straightforward, but with 11 to choose from, you can really step outside of the box here. Without fully understanding what I'm getting myself into, my team consists of the following: Madular, a male dwarven barbarian. Hey, somebody's gotta represent the short kings here. Gordinius, a male human paladin. Hope, a female elven thief. And Ziltoid, a male fuzzy wizard. If you don't know what a fuzzy is, here's a helpful illustration for you. Get a load of this guy. The most immediate disruption to the existing Ultima formula at this point is undoubtedly the combat. Let's recall the combat in Ultima 1 and 2. For the most part, you stand still, hitting enemies with attacks or spells until they die. Sometimes they'll briefly retreat before coming back immediately and then dying. Ultima 2 mixed things up by allowing enemies to immobilize or blind your characters, but for the most part, things shook out in much the same way. Combat has, until this point, been a weaker aspect of these games, no doubt about it. Especially up against the comparatively strategic combat of games like Wizardry, Ultima's insufficiencies in this area are clear. Therefore, with a handle on assembly, Garriott wiped the slate clean and re-envisioned what Ultima's combat would be. The resulting product is something significantly more strategic, visually interesting, and simply more impressive than anything we've seen yet. While traversing the overworld, enemies will spawn in at random locations, like in the previous games. Unlike those games, you do not engage enemies on the overworld itself. When an enemy makes contact with your character, your group will be sent into a separate battlefield screen where an enemy party will be fought. This makes the overworld map entirely representational. Your characters and enemy sprites are all abstractions of traveling bands. One of the most impressive things about these battle screens is how they reflect the map screen's geography. If you encounter an enemy in the woods, the battle screen will represent that. If you're in a boat and touch an enemy on the shoreline, the dynamic of the fight will reflect that too. Functionally, most battles are the same with some exceptions, but the sense of consistency is what most benefits the game. Encounters could have shared one bland background and that would have met expectation, yet the accuracy of the battle environments gives the game a special touch. The turn-based battles themselves are far more tactical and engaging than ever before. Your party is arranged into a front and back row depending on their order in the party menu, which is also the order in which they'll take turns. When it's a particular character's turn, they'll be able to move one space over, attack in one of 4 directions, or cast a spell. Afterwards, it automatically moves on to the next character's turn. It's simple and straightforward, but where variables really come into play is in the game's character creation. In previous games, race influenced starting stats. In Exodus, your race primarily dictates the potential upper limit of your attributes. For example, it's possible for a dwarf to achieve 99 strength, while a fuzzy will be capped out at 25. This makes it optimal to choose classes that harmonize well with the race you've chosen. It makes sense for a dwarf to be a barbarian, for instance. Their primary stat is strength, which affects raw damage, and to a lesser extent, dexterity, which affects their accuracy. Fuzzies are hyper-intelligent, so they're best off acting as wizards. There are also multiple hybrid classes in the game that complicate things. For example, the paladin is somewhere between a fighter and a cleric. It's not as good at fighting as a fighter, and it's not as good at clericing as a cleric, but the benefit of splitting that difference is that you don't need to spend 2 party slots on characters to perform both jobs. The alchemist is dexterous and intelligent, raising their combat accuracy but still allowing them to cast spells. The druid is both wise and intelligent, giving them the power to cast wizard spells and cleric prayers. So hopefully you can see how party composition is incredibly important out of the gate. Armor and weapons are no longer gated by attribute levels, but by class. The wage of the wizard's spellcasting abilities is that they can only wear cloth and use a dagger. The fighter, on the other hand, can wear plate mail and use almost any weapon. This makes it extremely important to consult the player's guide before pulling the trigger on character creation. Even if a team looks sound, there are some things that are hard to account for without having first-hand experience. As an example, the manual claims the thief's special ability involves stealing and disarming traps. Well, trap disarming is based on internal dice rolls, so to speak, which makes it an automatic process. I don't want to sound like I'm complaining here, but when my entire party is dying from bomb traps set in seemingly every treasure chest in Caesarea, it makes me feel like my thief isn't helping. Well, actually, you have to manually arrange your party so that the thief is at the very top of the list in order to have them be a trap disarmer. Not that you'd know that unless you just had a hunch. This also places the thief on the front lines of battle, which isn't a huge problem since they can just move away, but it's an annoying idiosyncrasy that you can't change. Perhaps the most interesting classes are those who can cast spells and/or prayers. This is where the included game booklets come in handy. The Liturgy of Truth and the Book of Amber Runes contain a list of usable in-game prayers and spells, respectively. In fact, not only does it contain a list of them, but each one is given a detailed description and in-world lore explanation. Entire pages are devoted to the explanation of individual spells. The pages of the prayer book are adorned with art resembling Byzantine iconography, often relevant to the prayer on the same page. The spellbook contains magic rune words as well as alchemical shapes and symbols. The extra mile they went to make it feel as though you're consulting real spellbooks is stellar. Ultima III is the first game in the series to use magic points as a resource. MP is a concept reminiscent of D&D's spell system, but given expedients appropriate for the faster pace of a video game. It's used up by casting spells and quickly restored simply by walking around or waiting outside of battles. The stat which affects magic points entirely depends on the class of the magic user. A wizard's MP is equal to their intelligence level. For a cleric, it's their wisdom level. For a paladin, it's half of their total wisdom level since their primary attribute is also strength. You don't unlock spells in Ultima III, so they aren't tied to a character's level per se. The limiting factor here is magic points. The maximum level a stat can be in character creation is 25. The first level wizard spell is called Repond. Casting it results in a random chance of eliminating all orcs, goblins, or trolls from the battlefield. It doesn't cost any magic points, but success isn't guaranteed, and even if you miss, it can only be used once per battle. Mentar will send a powerful ball of energy at an enemy, causing damage based on your own intelligence. However, it costs 35 magic points, placing it entirely out of your reach until your character is able to advance their stats. Now let me tell you, between your Apar Unums, your Alcourts, your Pontauruses, Sanctumanuses, and Dagmentars, between your Lorums, your Daglorums, and your Zixacubes, it'll be tough remembering some of these spells on the fly. This is especially the case given your method of casting them. Each of them corresponds to an alphabetical key. So A is your first level spell, B is your second level, and so on, each costing 5 more MP to cast than the previous. Once you hit those higher levels, having to keep track of 30 different abilities between both classes of magic is a tall order. I found myself defaulting to my second level spell, Mitar, fairly often. It's cheap, costing only 5 magic points, and acts as a reliable little magic missile. Aside from magic, you do have some ranged options in combat as well. Most classes will be capable of wielding slings, and quite a few can use bows too. Using these weapons is just a matter of positioning yourself parallel to an enemy and attacking in their direction. There's no friendly fire and obstacles won't stop a projectile, so you can keep weaker characters out of harm's way. If you attack with a dagger from range, you'll just hurl it at an enemy's head. I cannot tell you how many daggers we had to buy for Ziltoid because I kept accidentally throwing them. Come on, Richard, you used every single key for Ultima 2's controls. You're telling me there's no dedicated throw button? In fact, some of the controls in fights can get a little clumsy. The game will cue your actions, so if you start banging out commands too quickly or make a mistake, you just have to sit there and watch while it all plays out. Oh no, I hit left. He's gonna move left. Do not move left. Don't move left. He moved left. If you hit the wrong key or otherwise make a mistake, there's no going back. The game will just say, I don't know why you hit that key, but tough shit, and move on to the enemy's turn. There is an urgency in fights, as if you don't issue a command within a couple of seconds, the game will consider that turn passed and move on. To say this combat system represented a step forward from Ultima 2 would be a massive understatement. These changes to combat single-handedly elevate Ultima 3 to an entirely new category of RPG. Ultima was, in many ways, a forerunner to the then-yet-to-arrive tidal wave of Japanese console RPGs. Ultima 3 also illustrates the impact the series would have on the tactical RPG genre as well, alongside peers such as 1983's Bokosuka Wars. The combat in Exodus is simple, perhaps too simple for some modern tastes, yet it's that simplicity that's allowed Ultima 3 to age gracefully. It was ambitious, to be sure, but it never bit off more than it could chew. Its systems demand some patience, but the learning curve is reasonably shallow. That makes it a fun game, one that's easy to get into, but also one that garners discussion about party composition and optimization to this very day. With this fresh new combat system came an entirely new consideration on the developer's end: artificial intelligence. In previous games, enemy AI was incredibly simple. A series of yes or no checks. Is the player next to me? If yes, I'll attack. If no, I'm gonna pathfind towards the player. I'm gonna pathfind as best as I possibly can, bless my heart. Enemies still operate this way on the overworld, but in the battlefield things are a little different. Certain enemies have ranged abilities, which lets them get the better of you from a few spaces away. In addition to that, enemies can attack diagonally, you can't. This was meant to balance the game, giving the enemies with their rudimentary AI a chance to surround and get the better of you. And by God, when you first start this game, they will get the better of you. Within several minutes of starting the game, hope died, and the irony of that is not lost on me. There's a very strict set of preparations you need to make if you want to stand a chance. The game begins next to the domain of Lord British, the Castle Britannia, and the town of Britain. Visiting the castle, you'll find some kind of weird sex thing going on here, so let's visit the town instead. Like in previous games, food is always something you need to concern yourself with, although thankfully it's been greatly rebalanced. Rather than simply killing you outright when your coffers run dry, the character without food will start taking chip damage as you walk around. Regardless, loading up on food in the beginning is a good idea. Also, all of your characters will only have daggers and potato sacks for equipment, so new weapons at the very least are in order. What do you do from here? Well, the world is your oyster, sort of. The mysteries of Sosaria beg to be uncovered. The game map, pound for pound, is smaller than either of the previous Ultimas, but exploration itself serves a far more meaningful purpose. There's a distinctly early Ultima lack of direction in-game here, which places the onus on you to go out and hunt for information. In the game's various towns, you'll find strange people in back alleys, pub owners, and seers able to provide you with that most valuable of resources: information. As has been the case for Ultima, the information is often cryptic and difficult to understand. As much as the combat and various other aspects of the game have been improved, the story still doesn't amount to much. You'll be told to seek a lot of things. Seek the shrines of truth, seek the Lord of Time, seek the mark of the king, seek ye thy fortune. I'm seeking, okay? I'm seeking as fast as I possibly can. Dawn, the city of myth and magic. That's not even a hint, you're just saying the name of a thing. Insert cards into panels? Okay, I'm just being deliberately misled at this point. There's not really much you can do at this stage in the game, being landlocked to the central Sasarian continent. In order to leave, you'll first need to level up a bit and make your characters stronger. Much like Ultima 2, in order to increase your health, you'll have to talk to Lord British. However, instead of trading him gold for hit points, he'll increase your health by 100 for free, provided you've earned enough experience points. This makes Exodus the first game in the series to feature something approximating traditional level ups. There are a few limiting factors, the first of which is a hard roadblock. Lord British will only advance your characters to level 5. After this, he'll cryptically tell you to seek the mark, while refusing to elaborate or advance you further. The second factor is that the early game can be brutal, especially if none of your party members are capable of healing. There are a few crucial cleric spells in Ultima III, namely Sanctu, which heals a target character for 20-ish hit points, and Alcourt, which cures poison status from the selected character. If you're not playing a class capable of using these spells, you'll have to visit a healer. Healer services are really damn expensive in the early game. Well, that's no problem, we have the stalwart Gordinius, a paladin who does not have enough wisdom to cast Sanctu. I may not be able to lay on hands, but I can give you a friendly pat on the back. That's almost as good. Well, maybe it won't be so bad. We should be strong enough to kill some monsters and make enough gold for healers, right? I'm not gonna lie to you, Ziltoid, it's not looking good. Even if you're capable of slaying monsters, the vast majority of the loot they leave behind is trapped with bombs or acid. These traps present an even greater threat than most enemies, and hope is dead, so nobody is capable of disarming them. This brings me to another interesting feature of Ultima III, its modularity. During character creation, you're not actually creating a party specifically for your campaign, but adding characters to a roster, one which can record 20 characters in all. This means that if one character isn't pulling their weight, you can swap them out for an existing character in the middle of an adventure, or even create a new one altogether. Of course, they'll be entering the game at level 1, but it's often a good option. Gordinius, God love him, was a liability. A lovable one, but a liability nonetheless. We shook hands, leaving on good terms, and enlisted the help of his second cousin, Gorderoth. Gorderoth is a bona fide cleric. While he can't wear heavy armor and his weapon selection is limited, he can cast Sanctu, which makes him MVP in the early game. This focus on modular systems extends beyond character creation as well. Let's take casting Sanctu for example. First, you press the C key for Cast Spell. You'll then be prompted to select the party member doing the casting. From there, you can use keys A through O to select your desired spell, in this case, C Cast Sanctu. Finally, you'll be allowed to choose a target for healing. Simply talking or transacting with townspeople will give you the option of choosing a party member, then choosing a direction for that transaction. Rather than just press key to do thing, you're prompted to slot in actions and the characters performing them. It's a nice way to make it feel as though each party member has their own unique contribution to the adventure, although in most instances it doesn't really matter who's doing what. It can also be a little bit cumbersome, for instance buying or selling armor and weapons. First, you have to press the Z button to check a character's status. That's the only way of knowing what they have equipped, and also what's in their inventory. Then you have to press T to transact, select the party member, look in the direction of the shopkeeper, look at their stock, and then cycle through the corresponding keys to buy or sell whatever it is you want to. Often your own weapons or armor will be unequipped for no real reason when you interact with the store owner, so after gearing everyone up, you have to check all 4 of their status screens to make sure you're not walking around naked. There are a lot of controls to remember, and it's certainly not the simplest way of designing a party interface. Yet, for a first attempt and so early in the history of party-based RPGs, it's a more than respectable implementation. Once you reach the initial level cap, you'll find frigates spawning at shorelines and attacking your party. If you manage to survive the onslaught, you can actually board the frigate, kill the crew members, then steal the ship. No blue tassels necessary. This opens up your options exponentially and makes exploration a much less dangerous affair. You can use the ship's cannons to fire at enemies on the shore, which makes life easier but also doesn't award you with any experience points. Your main enemy at this point is the wind itself. You'll notice some text at the bottom of the screen letting you know what kind of wind you're experiencing in that moment. This dictates where you can go in your ship. You'll never be able to fight against the wind, and a calm wind just strands you in place. This is especially nerve-wracking considering this whirlpool keeps getting dangerously close to the ship. The whole wind direction thing, it's an interesting idea. I respect the commitment to realistic world interactions. But by God, it does not make the game better. Most of the time, you'll just sit there mashing your desired direction key until the wind blows in your favor. And for some reason, it never seems to do that. My brain is wired to see east wind and think, oh, I guess I can go east, but no, obviously an east wind is blowing from the east, meaning you can only use it to go west. So you can only move about half the time, and when you can, you have to think in terms of opposites. I'm just glad they didn't carry the wind system over to the projectiles in combat. Imagine arrows flying back at you. The rewards for exploration itself are greater in Ultima 3 than previous games. For one thing, the towns are laid out similarly to Ultima 2. Each one has its own unique set of stores, some of which have better or worse stock than others. It's a good idea to thoroughly explore towns. NPCs skulking behind buildings almost always have something of value to say regarding your quest to eliminate Exodus. Sometimes you'll find named characters based on Richard's real-life friends and associates. Dupre represents Greg Dykes, Richard's friend, while Chamino is Richard himself. They're both named after their characters at the Society for Creative Anachronism. Chuckles is, of course, Chuckles, Chuck Boucher. Most of these characters are nothing more than fun little Easter eggs, although they will become prevalent in our later adventures. Aiding your ability to move around are moon gates. Similar to Ultima 2's time gates, moon gates will warp you to different areas around the map, minus the whole time travel thing, of course. When moon gates appear and their destination depends entirely on the phases of Sosaria's twin moons, shown at the top of the game interface. Yeah, a pair of new moons looks like boobies, get it out of your system. The left moon dictates the appearance of the moon gate, while the right moon affects where that moon gate will send you. A particular gate may only appear during a waxing gibbous, meaning if you want to use it, you'll have to pass time until that particular phase arrives. This acts as a sort of proto-fast travel system, allowing you to access remote parts of the map quickly. There are times where a whirlpool will destroy your ship, but the moon gates almost always work as a contingency plan. Without a map at hand, it's easy to get lost after stepping through a gate, but Ultima 3's game world is on the smaller side, so it shouldn't take too long to get your bearings. Once you have a boat, and you know when and where moon gates will appear, you'll be set to start cautiously exploring more of Sosaria. You can even buy horses to outrun enemies, but they are expensive and more experience points are never a bad thing. An aspect of Ultima 3 which greatly changes your relationship to the game world is the party's line of sight. While walking around, you'll notice that certain parts of the map are visible while others are shrouded in darkness. With each movement, the game runs calculations in order to depict only what your character should see from their vantage point. You'll never be sure what's behind a building unless you go there yourself. It almost couldn't be more different from traversal in Ultima 1, where towns were one screen and you saw every tile at once. Even on the world map, walking through a dark forest will shrink your viewport down to a tiny 3x3 grid, making getting your bearings and avoiding enemies difficult. It's a clever way of depicting the sort of fear and confusion faced by, say, Frodo and his compatriots as they walk the old forest. Unfortunately, there's no Tom Bombadil here to save your party, aside from perhaps you, the player. Your prime directive at this point is more money. Equipment, and in particular armor, is prohibitively expensive, and some of the enemies you face outside of the mainland can do a real number on your party. While MP automatically recovers over time, anti-poison spells are too expensive to use yet, and healing spells provide only marginal health. Having some extra money to visit healers, therefore, is recommended. One easy way to make some much-needed early game cash is in the town of View. Typically, killing innocent people would result in town guards crushing you into dust, as is Ultima tradition. Here though, there are no guards, and the clerics don't seem too bothered seeing their comrades slayed in front of them. It's a pretty easy way to gain money and experience points. The only party member who gains experience for defeating an enemy is the one who performed the killing blow. It's not an ideal system, but being such a small team with no point of reference, it's hard to fault the game for this system. This makes a controlled environment such as facing off against defenseless clerics a good way of bringing weaker characters up to par. Hey look, I'm not happy about it either. Take it up with Lord British. He's the one who makes this the only viable strategy for money early game. On top of spending money on food, equipment, and healing, it's also prudent to visit the various Thieves Guild in Sosaria to stock up on dungeoneering gear. Items like torches, light dark areas, and gems provide you with area maps when peered into. Eventually, while cruising around the map in your frigate, you'll inevitably come across a whirlpool. Conventional wisdom says stay away, but the unconventional and unwise man cannot help himself. Traveling through the whirlpool destroys your ship but sends you somewhere unexpected, a realm outside Caesarea, a realm known as Ambrosia. You may have noticed that leveling up in Ultima 3 only raises your hit points, but with so many spells we're not able to cast yet, surely there must be a way to raise one's attributes. Well, I'm happy to say we do not need to take a road trip to the Hotel California. In Ambrosia, guarded by strange enemies, you'll find 4 shrines, each one corresponding to a particular stat: dexterity, strength, intelligence, and wisdom. Tithing 100 gold at these shrines will raise the associated stat by 1, and you can donate as much as you'd like with each interaction. The question is, what exactly is Ambrosia? Well, it's referred to as a mythical lost continent, entirely separate from Caesarea. It appears to be steeped in ancient magic, allowing the shrines to act as a font of power, granting skill advancement in exchange for gold. Every time you enter Ambrosia, everything is exactly as it was prior to your last visit. Enemy placements, doors, and the location of boats are all untouched, like you were never there. It makes the area feel like a magical, dreamlike place out of space and time. Even the name Ambrosia, from the Greek ambrotos, meaning immortal, makes you feel like a meek visitor in the realm of gods. Regardless of the lore implications, Ambrosia mechanically acts as a hub world through which you can level up your various stats. To reach the Shrine of Dexterity, you have to defeat some thieves and steal their frigate. To reach the Shrine of Strength, you have to fight a bunch of horses, which again, I'm not thrilled about, but the game puts me in these weird equine self-defense situations. I just gotta bonk. Then the Wisdom and Intelligence shrines are behind this door. On top of the dungeon equipment, the Thieves Guild sells some other things too, like keys. Keys, which open these doors. Keys, which I do not have. In order to leave Ambrosia and purchase more keys, I need only go back through the whirlpool. Only one problem. My boat was destroyed on the ride here. Well, there was one boat that spawned in this body of water. I used it to reach a shrine. I'll just sail that one through the door, which requires a key to open. Remember to bring keys when you come to Ambrosia. Thankfully, you're not allowed to save in this area. On top of adding some risk-reward to the adventure, it also prevents you from royally screwing yourself. The keys then allow you to access the last 2 shrines, arguably the most important ones since they unlock new potential spells and prayers. Not sure why this guy's locked up. Come on out, buddy. Oh god, oh man. Oh god, oh man. Oh god, oh man. With your hands now thoroughly soaked in jester blood and your party more capable than ever, it's time to return to Caesarea and conquer its dungeons. Of course, the first-person perspective dungeons of previous games return. All dungeons are still aesthetically identical to each other, but thankfully the game no longer relies on wireframe graphics. Those old dungeons got confusing very quickly. Here there's a solidity to the walls being drawn with a sort of vertical hatching. It's not perfect to be sure, but it is a step in the right direction. Dungeons themselves work in similar ways with some notable changes. For one thing, you no longer see enemies walking about or engage them on the dungeon screen. Rather, wandering around results in random battles, sending you to the same kind of screen you'd see on the overworld. Like Ultima 2, dungeons also have predetermined layouts. The question marks seen on the map represent one of a few potential things. One is a trap which deals damage to your team. Another is a fountain, which can either heal you in full or poison you, which is a bit of a gamble. There's magical wind that puts out your torches or uncasts your light spell. And, in the sourest reunion since Pink Floyd took to the stage in 2005, gremlins are back. Remember these guys from Macalabeth? Well, thankfully they don't take half of your entire food supply this time, but they still eat away at your stockpile. You're also not even given the satisfaction of killing them in this game. They just take your stuff if you walk near them. Anyway, the nice thing is that the location of all these hazards, as well as the dungeon's treasure, is hard-coded. Looking into a gem from the Thieves Guild helps to not only determine where things are, but also where you are. It all makes the act of dungeon crawling a relatively painless experience compared to the prior games. It's just as well because dungeon crawling is, once again, mandatory, at least to some extent. One piece of information you'll pick up on your journey is that you should be seeking marks in the various dungeons of Caesarea. And so, let the spelunking begin. There are a total of 7 dungeons in Ultima 3. This fairly small number makes mark hunting much more manageable than it'd otherwise be. Don't get me wrong, there's still potential for bad times ahead, but you've got options. Most marks can be found in one of several dungeons if you're having a hard time in one. There's also some class advantages worth considering here. For one thing, having a wizard or cleric along for the ride really cuts down on the misery. Having both a Gordoroth and a Ziltoid makes things downright pleasant. Both are able to cast light spells. Lumine, Somine, Lorem, and Daglorum all effectively supplant torches, giving you one less thing to worry about. Both classes can also teleport you one floor above and one floor below, acting as the precious ladder spells from previous games. Wizards can teleport you to random spots on the same dungeon level, or, in an emergency situation, can teleport you out of the dungeon altogether. Clerics with their various healing abilities can keep you going in dungeons for longer periods of time. Gee, thanks Gordoroth, I'm clacking my heels together with joy. There are some dungeons, such as the Mines of Morinia, no place for a bobbit mind you, where having a wizard in your party is absolutely necessary. Ladders down are walled off, so if you're looking for a legitimate passage down, you'll be spending many hours literally banging your head against walls. That's because illusory walls are still a thing, so this being the one dungeon where there actually aren't any is a particularly cruel trick. This necessitates the use of a floor down spell, the repeated use of which makes pretty short work of the dungeons. At the very bottom of the Mines of Morinia you'll find 2 marks, the Mark of Kings and the Mark of Fire. Touching them with each character causes some damage, but it's a necessary step in searing the mark into their flesh and bringing you one step closer to confronting Exodus. Once you've found the other 2 marks, similarly hidden in various dungeons, you'll be fully marked and ready to move on to your next quest. Each mark actually serves a pragmatic purpose in moving you through the game, much like the barrier ring in Ultima 2. The Mark of Fire gives you immunity to fire damage, allowing you to cross lava rivers. The Mark of Kings increases the level cap from 5 to 25, and let me tell you, I had a lot of levels banked at this point. What can I say? Killing horses is thirsty work, I guess. The Mark of Force allows you to pass through various force fields in the game unharmed, and the Mark of the Snake allows you to move past the Great Earth Serpent, which guards Exodus's domain. There's a much stronger sense of coherence in the mythology of Ultima 3 than its predecessors. Those games are often very silly and self-referential. You have phasers, space travel, Red Lobster, the Hotel California. It feels like a bit of a joke. A startlingly competent joke given the time in which it was made, but a joke nonetheless. Ultima 3 is generally seen as the game where Ultima hit its stride, and it's not hard to see why. In terms of its story, this game grounds the Ultima name in something more sincere than had been seen previously. The bulk of the plot is still told through the instruction manuals, but in terms of its lore and backstory, it feels much sturdier, like the foundation of something great. The lost lands of Ambrosia, the Great Earth Serpent, the marks, it all adds up to a more believable, if still simplistic, folklore. After receiving the Mark of Fire, and against my better judgment, the party can talk to the Jester in Britannia Castle. This one being burned alive. Thankfully, he provides coordinates. See Tavern Keepers, this is how you give advice. Specific, to the point, no rhyming or alliteration necessary. Anyway, have a good one, dude. If you follow the Jester's directions and wait there for twin new moons, the magical city of Dawn will emerge from the fog. It's actually a really cool moment, and you can't help but feel accomplished for having come across it. On top of selling some excellent gear, you're also pointed in the direction of some exotic weapons. Well, actually, that's not necessarily true. You're told that exotic weapons exist and that you can dig them up. After searching high and low for the dig key on the command list, you'll find that there's another facet of the game at play here. Pressing O will bring you to the Other menu, where you can manually type out the commands of your choosing. With this menu, you can, among other things, actually bribe guards and gain entry to treasure hoards or more easily steal from shops. You can also dig, and doing so on 2 of Cesaria's indistinct islands will reveal the exotic weapons and the exotic armor. The seasoned D&D player will recognize exotic as a descriptor of any equipment that isn't commonly used. The layman may assume they're digging up something sexy, And hey, it's your game, it's your imagination. Maybe the ancient forest elves wore negligee into battle. Maybe that's why everybody on the shore is staring at you. Fresh! Another use for the other command actually takes place in Ambrosia. The shrines serve dual purposes, although you wouldn't know it unless you stumble across a rare piece of dialogue or step on a particular square in the Dungeon of the Snake. While standing at a shrine, typing search will reveal one of 4 different cards: love, soul, moons, and death. Obscure items, but necessary in order to finish the game. While you could storm off to Exodus's castle at this point, there's another important tip you may receive. You're told to seek the Lord of Time somewhere in a dungeon. The observant player may think of the Dungeon of Time. There, at the very last floor, you'll find the Time Lord. His origin, as well as who or even what he is ambiguous, but he holds arcane wisdom and valuable insight. The one way is love, soul, moons, and death. All else fails. Now, with the marks, the cards, and the exotic weapons, you're ready to head to Exodus's castle and slay the fiend once and for all. You need to travel through a lava pool and force fields in order to reach the castle, hence the need for the marks. Also, the only weapons that work once inside are the exotic weapons, rendering ranged weapons like bows or slings ineffective. The enemies here are the toughest in the game by a country mile. Also, explosions will randomly occur, damaging your characters with no real way to predict where they'll happen. Wait, you guys? I'm not even stealing a crop duster. Hell, I'm not even in a town. Why are town guards beating my ass? Oh no, this must be where the vengeful souls of all the clerics I've killed end up. It was an honest misunderstanding. The most difficult aspect of the castle is that random explosion. You can't heal your characters because you can't stand still to let your magic regenerate. Magic does work in fights, but you're best off saving your limited MP for healing spells, since enemies in here cause poison. It's a pretty nasty scene, I'll tell you that right now. Enemies fire ranged attacks at you, hiding behind barriers and chipping away at your health pool. Hope! No! I'll get you, you son of a bitch! Ziltoid, stand back, you fool! Oh, the humanity! Hope and Ziltoid both wiped from the face of Cesaria. Their deaths shall not go unavenged! We're so close to Exodus. I can see his chambers. Wait, I sense an enemy nearby. Oh no. Attack the area around you. Attack like your life depends on it, because it does. Magular, no. Oh, he was the most handsome and lovable one of the entire group. Come on, Gorderoth, murder this floor and go home. What would I tell Gordinius if he didn't make it? Whew, floor defeated. Okay, move up. Alright, we're screwed. Wait, sequestering yourself into the corner. It's kinda genius. Why didn't the others think of that? Come on, man, you're doing good. Keep it up, Gorderoth, I'm rooting for you. Oh no! Oh, what tragedy. What horrors await in the world that Exodus has in store for us. But then, just as things seemed darkest, as the light seemingly left our hero's eyes, I restarted the game and loaded a save from outside the castle. So yes, the floor. Much has been made about the floor being an enemy in this game, and it's easy to see why. On top of the sheer absurdity of it all, having to defeat multiple waves of enemies that are effectively invisible after this whole gauntlet is cruel and unusual punishment. According to information from latter entries in the series, Exodus used his magic to bring the floor to life and attack intruders. I gotta say, it's a cockamamie plan, but it's actually not that bad of an idea. You're essentially fighting an invisible foe, one whose location can only be determined by letting it hit you. Even then, enemies can attack diagonally, so you have no choice but to move around, swinging at thin air until you get lucky and make contact. The one thing you'd hope you can trust is the earth below your very feet. Without that, the situation becomes pretty chaotic. Having your party's backs up against the south wall and just attacking upward is a pretty effective strategy. As long as you're not already on death's door by the time you get here, it's not too bad. At last, you'll reach the final chamber. Like Ultima 1 and 2, the third game does not feature a traditional final boss. Rather, you stumble across some machines. What am I supposed to do with these panels? Panels? Wait a minute, those cards. The only way is love, soul, moons, and death. All else fails. What is the nature of Exodus? Man, machine, demon? In the end, it matters not. His life force is extinguished from Caesarea, and peace may reign once again, for a time. I'm sure we can expect a new, more formidable evil to take its place, and I'm not just saying that because the ending of the game teases Ultima IV, its simple pattern recognition. Ultima III Exodus represented a supreme leap forward for the series. It would act as an entry point for many series fans, and in the years since its release, it's been regarded as a foundational RPG. Outside of tabletop games, player choice was hardly in the gaming lexicon, but Ultima III leans into this concept, giving you a vastly increased number of character options, almost overwhelming at the time, all in service of a combat system that's so far beyond those of its predecessors that they're barely even recognizable as such. The character creation, leveling system, dungeon crawling, and traversal options would act as a framework to expand upon in further entries. The game has aged with dignity, and the combat still works surprisingly well due to its simplicity rather than in spite of it. That said, some things hold Ultima III back in hindsight, namely the act of moving through the main story itself, if you want to call it that. Like its predecessors, the game heavily relies on obtuse context clues, and most of your time with the game will likely be spent grinding away for money and experience points. Ultima III is at its absolute best when you're pursuing a clear, sensible goal with the intent of progressing to the next step. That may sound like a no-brainer, but this was a time of fluctuations in RPG history. Ultima III bridges the gap between the Silver Age and Golden Age of RPGs. The Silver Age, in which killing monsters and dungeon crawling was novelty enough to warrant the price of admission, and the Golden Age, where consumer tastes were becoming more discerning, resulting in studios writing more intricate plot lines and developing more engaging game systems. Of course, it's easier nowadays to see where Ultima III Exodus fits into the overall scheme of things. At the time, it was simply regarded by many as the best CRPG ever made. The party-based combat brought it up to parity with its chief competitor, Wizardry, while its feeling of adventure and exploration was unparalleled. The series' trademark movie references and overall silliness took a backseat to cogent and grounded world building. Origin's emphasis was on convincing players that Caesarea was greater than the sum of its parts. You would have been hard-pressed to find a CRPG junkie in 1983 who didn't agree that they had succeeded. In following with the Ultima series pattern, Exodus was the biggest critical and financial success yet. More copies of the game had shipped than Akalabeth, Ultima I, and Ultima II combined, over 100,000 units in its first year. This made it one of 1983's best-selling pieces of software and took a tremendous financial load off of Origin's back. Thanks to Origin's commitment to porting their software to multiple platforms, Ultima III found its way onto computers across the country and beyond. Chief among these were the Atari 800, as well as the Commodore 64. The latter of these had undergone a significant price cut at the time. This made it an appealing alternative to video game consoles, especially considering Commodore computers included a legally questionable Atari joystick plugin. In any case, it seemed that Origin was wise to place so much emphasis on ports and adaptations. Yet, with great power came great responsibility. Ultima III was rife with bugs, including, in its original release, a typo which made progression impossible unless the player misspelled the word alter. You can thank Garriott's world-class spelling for that one. The internet as we know it didn't exist, so delivering a patch was out of the question. Still, Garriott states that nobody complained about that particular issue. It's probably because most never came close to finishing the game, which wasn't unusual at the time. Those who managed to beat the odds and complete Ultima III were told to call Origin and report their feat, as was the case since Akalabeth. Lord British would even send you an autographed certificate if you made it that far. Since the Garriotts were now running their own company, this would also be the first time that Garriott was hearing opinions directly from the customers. He quickly learned to parse the criticism, finding valuable feedback amongst the grousing. Between the calls coming in, ports being developed, and pre-production being done for Origin's next game, the company had its hands full. During this time, Origin managed to publish its first non-Ultima game, Caverns of Callisto was a simple arcade shoot-'em-up programmed entirely by Chuckles. It didn't amount to much, but if nothing else, Origin proved to themselves and others that they were not one-trick ponies. Amongst the constant static, Richard himself was still receiving unwanted attention regarding his supposed veneration of diablerie. As funny as it is to look back at the accusations now, at the time it really got under Richard's skin. Not the speculation regarding the fate of his eternal soul per se, but the lack of nuance in the discourse surrounding his games. What did people see in Ultima? For all of the many hours he spent hunched over a keyboard, programming late into the night, the fruit of his labors could be so easily written off as morally repugnant. Richard had always thought of his worlds in a technical sense. As a D&D dungeon master, he was concerned with guiding his players from encounter to encounter, optimizing combat, and trimming what he saw as the fat. In his video games, he would look to his engines themselves for improvements, iterations to make the games play better. More class options, better combat, smoother controls. Important concerns, but relegated entirely to the systematic. Perhaps there was another angle from which to approach the next Ultima game. One that considered these questions of morality, asking the player to look outside of the game and into their own hearts for the solutions. A game that didn't simply play better than its predecessor, but one that would confront players and armchair critics alike with complex, philosophical subject matter. Next time on the Ultima Retrospective. Best and worst Nicolas Cage film. Oh boy, okay. You know, he's actually done a lot of solid flicks. I'd say in the best slot, maybe Raising Arizona. Worst is probably Wicker Man, but at least that's entertaining, so I don't know, Left Behind maybe? His name is Rayford Steele in that movie though, which is kind of awesome. Have you considered doing music-based content before? I would maybe do something with my brothers who are actual musicians. I like music, but I don't have a musical background, so I have a hard time breaking down technical aspects. I go more based on feels, which can only take you so far. Worst SNES game that I've played? I don't know, probably Family Feud. The other team always knows the exact answer. Feel okay? It's bullshit. Which Final Fantasy game has the best soundtrack? This is a brutally hard question. I really like the synth choices for FF8, but composition-wise, I think I would predictably go with 7. My favorite series track is the Red Wings theme from FF4 though. There are not many songs in the series that communicate as much with as little. What's your favorite plot twist in a game? So I'll just say, avoiding spoilers here, the entire plot of Metal Gear Solid 2, because there's so many twists, like the purpose of the big shell, the nature of the Wise Men's Committee, and the like post-credits blurb, the S3 plan. It's all so good. They don't make you jump out of your seat like some plot twists, but there's a lot of subtle recontextualization that adds some layers to the story that makes it more interesting when you replay it. It's a very intelligently written game. I'd like to extend a special thank you to those patrons in my Persons of Lordly Caliber tier. Adam Safranco, Matthew Sean Dick, Banana Turnip, Avil and Hime Takamura, True Manalist, Spencer Kennelly, Smo Bun, John Turcott, Captain, Baby Squirrel, Shane Shack, Mr. Shifty, Buster Drew, Francois, Fanar, Fenrir Lives, Silvar, Olo Shadow, Guko, Jordan Laughlin, Jordan Miller, Hayden Hudson, Rocketman, Jay Hune, Azure and Celia Midsummer, Destrega, Tepid Tag Tournament, F, James Adair, Sable Dragon Rook, Cameron himself, Einel Hander, Kelly Slaughter, Zeta, Caleb the Wanderer, Nicholas Esposito, Stephen Clancy, Cap Hoop Nachos, Chew, Isaac Hampton, Kiwami Means Beans, Ben Augusto, Beta Zeta, NVTF, Worston Show, Kenny Mitchell, Maginect, Grant Roman Pontifex, Maximus Shalavartis IV, The Humble, Pace Forever, Metallion, The Bloke, Hypnotoad Trance, Sir Peon, Dennis Earl, Oakvale Yokel, Chris Walker, Half Daft, Thank you very much for your ongoing support. I appreciate each and every one of you. If you're interested in helping out the channel while gaining access to some sweet bonus content, please consider becoming a patron. Link in the description if you want to check out the different tiers. Thank you all for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Until I see you next time, stay healthy, wealthy, and wise.